There are stories meant to be whispered between trembling lips, accounts that linger in the shadows of history, haunting the rural crossroads and creaking porches of small-town America. Tonight, in the rolling hills of 1901 Tennessee, we unravel the chilling truth behind the kind of evil that can hide behind a pulpit, the monstrous legacy of Thomas Vale, a preacher whose devotion spiraled into terror, a man whose flames of faith scorched everything and everyone around him. In an era when the smell of wood smoke mingled with hope and uncertainty, when faith was a blazing torch guiding simple folk through dark times, no one could have imagined that a monster would be born from their own pews. Yet beneath the polished shoes and thundering sermons, Thomas Vale harbored desires more sinister than salvation, and the fires he set would soon illuminate horrors too cruel for easy forgetting. If you think you know what a preacher is, if you trust the light of the church to ward off the dark, let us walk together down these dirt roads and listen to what really happened, as the countryside itself became a confessional for secrets no man was meant to bear. This is no ghost story, no satanic fantasy or fever dream. This is the account, the investigation, the pain, the betrayal of one town's slow walk into the heart of human darkness, and so it begins. At dawn, the town of Holly Glen emerged from the night in a hush of pale mist, the clapboard houses peeking like furtive children from between ancient oaks and maples. The air was cold, heavy with the memory of firewood and river fog, and somewhere down the main lane, the only lane wide enough for more than one wagon, crows picked at last autumn's corn, their cries sharp in the fading quiet. Thomas Vale's arrival that December was quiet, respectful. He came alone with a battered suitcase and a worn black Bible, the corners of its leather scuffed pale. Few in Holly Glen remembered much of his predecessor. The old pastor had withered and left on account of poor nerves, or so it was said, and the church elders were eager for new inspiration. Vale's letters, full of fervor and classical verse, had convinced even the most cautious deacon that they'd found a shepherd powerful enough to fend off despair. Standing in the center aisle of the little whitewashed church, Thomas Vale seemed to radiate certainty. His stare unsettled the children, but his voice, low, melodic, confident, wove through the chill air with the conviction of thunder. At his first sermon he spoke of fire, purifying, consuming, holy. Some townsfolk wept. Others clenched hands on their knees, unwilling to let go of worry. Word spread fast. Vale's talent for the pulpit was undeniable. Soon, benches filled with neighbors drawn from as far as the next valley. The preacher never married, nor did he seek company beyond the church, and most found this a blessing. No gossip, no temptations or messy affairs. He lived with the discipline of a monk in the small parsonage out back, working late by candlelight even after midnight, calling on parishioners when storms hit and crops failed. For a brief season, the town believed it was saved, but not everyone trusted him. Sarah Caldwell, a schoolteacher with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, remembered the way he gripped the pulpit, his knuckles white with something like fury. She heard rumors, whispers of children punished too harshly at Sunday school, of confessions pressed from the most frightened widows. She watched as fear, disguised as faith, crept into the faces of those who'd once greeted her with easy smiles. Late one night, while the air held the bite of impending snow, Sarah saw Vale standing in the courtyard behind the church, his silhouette black against a field of pale stars. He wasn't praying. He wasn't moving at all, just staring at the darkness with a rigid stillness that didn't fit her idea of a man at peace with God. That winter, a girl vanished. Her name was Lila Gray, the miller's youngest daughter. She had auburn hair and a singing voice that lifted spirits at Sunday services. She disappeared after choir practice. At first the town clung to explanations. Runaways, wolves, the river. But Vale led the prayers, delivered the eulogies, and insisted that Lila's soul was safe now, free from worldly pain. Sarah's suspicion hardened. Vale's sermons turned to the theme of sacrifice, a cleansing by fire, a necessary purge. The more he spoke, the more the townfolk retreated into uneasy silence, their shared grief a kindling waiting for a spark. And soon there would be flames. The winter deepened in Holly Glen, settling over the landscape like a woolen shroud. Down in the valley, the river coursed sluggishly, its banks marked with the skeletons of sycamores and the spindly outlines of half-drowned fences. The town itself was a pocket of human stubbornness, huddled among pine and oak. Clapboard houses, all built close to the earth with narrow porches and battered swings, leaned into the wind as if bracing for truths too heavy to bear. Smoke curled from their brick chimneys, mingling with the persistent fog that rolled in every dawn and lingered until noon. By day, life in Holly Glen followed familiar rhythms. The schoolhouse bell rang out at 8, summoning children in patched homespun coats. Men gathered at the general store, exchanging stories over rough sacks of coal or flour, news traveling slow along muddy roads, carried by wagons and on boots caked with the clay red of Tennessee soil. Women scrubbed linen in steaming basins out back, their talk quieter since Lila's disappearance, their laughter rare. Even in 1901, with its promise of a new century, the old fears never really left. The looming threat of floods, the dark line between white and colored, the unspoken rules that governed every neighborly glance and handshake. Against this backdrop, Thomas Vale moved like a shadow among them, always watching, always present. His sermons grew more urgent, fire becoming the central metaphor from which he drew every lesson. "The world is a field of chaff," he declared on one stormy Sunday. "The church packed beyond seating. And the Lord's wrath, like a purifying fire, will claim the impure." It was hard for a while to distinguish Vale's warnings from the real world. After all, in Holly Glen, fire was a true and constant threat. The river's floods had driven families onto higher ground more than once, and outbuildings regularly fell victim to stray sparks or spilled kerosene. Sometimes at dusk, the anxious would peer out at the horizon, looking for signs of smoke. But this winter, there was something new, a tension among the townsfolk, a sense that the chill in the air wasn't only from the season. Rumors crept between houses. Some said Vale's visits to grieving homes stretched too long into the night. Others swore they'd heard shouting from inside the parsonage, voices wrapped tight in prayer or threat. Sarah Caldwell listened, gathering pieces, every indignity and uneasy glance filing them away. On market day, Sarah lingered near the mill, watching Vale as he spoke to the miller's wife. He handed her a parcel wrapped in a handkerchief, his fingers tightening on hers a fraction too long. When he caught Sarah's eye, he smiled, a priestly, practiced smile, but nothing in his eyes matched the gesture. She felt a prickle of unease travel up her spine. That evening, with the wind rattling the panes of her rented room, Sarah reread her journal. She had begun recording Vale's words, snatches of sermons and counsel, more out of habit than design. Now her notes chilled her. Repeated calls for sacrifice, references to flames, oblique warnings about the dangers lurking in their midst. Was it only her imagination, or did he take pleasure in conjuring catastrophe? Each phrase isolated could be dismissed. Together they painted a pattern of dread. The days pressed on, and so did Vale's influence. He helped organize a relief committee for the Gray family, collecting clothing and grain. But conversations in the store shifted. Some women whispered about children frightened by Vale's questions, and a farmhand's son claimed Vale had cornered him behind the church to demand confession for unspoken sins. With each passing Sunday, the congregation began to divide. The faithful clung to Vale's fierce certainty, convinced his suffering matched their own. Others, like Sarah and a handful of skeptics, found themselves drawn together in uneasy alliance. They met in secret, poring over the details of Lila's last day. Considering possibilities they dared not say aloud, late one afternoon, a barn on the Gray property went up in flames, a sudden, ferocious blaze that devoured the hayloft and left the charred remains of small animals inside. Men formed a bucket line, fighting smoke and heat until dawn, but the fire took everything. Vale was first on the scene, or so he claimed, his boots muddied, his hair wild with sweat. He offered prayer for the lost, speaking in a voice both gentle and unyielding. But Sarah noticed the look he exchanged with the sheriff, an unspoken agreement, perhaps, or a silent command. The town's fear, once aimed at the nameless dark, had found a new fuel. Some whispered that Lila's disappearance and the fire were linked, that God, or someone else, was delivering punishment for hidden wrongs. The next morning, Sarah walked alone to the church. Snow had fallen overnight, muting the landscape, turning fences and posts into soft white sculptures. The church stood silent, its bell motionless in the frozen air. As she approached, she saw footprints circling the building, deep and purposeful. Inside, the sanctuary was dark. Only the faintest light stained the stained glass, turning saints and angels into flickering shadows. Sarah moved down the center aisle, her steps echoing. Something sharp glinted on the altar. A singed length of ribbon, the same muddy red as Lila's favorite sash. Sarah froze, her breath forming pale clouds before her. At sunrise, the sheriff called a meeting in the square. Families gathered, faces pale and pinched. Vale stood at the edge, hands folded, gaze fixed forward. He spoke when asked, briefly with sympathy, but never offered answers, only more reasons to trust in fire, to look within for sin. The town chose silence over confrontation. They were not prepared to accuse a man of God, but Sarah could not shake the chilling certainty that something had shifted, that a line had been crossed. She walked the snow-covered roads back to her room, her boots crunching the ice, making a promise to herself. If the truth hid in fire and fear, she would find it, even if it burned her too. That night, as wind rattled the frosted windows and the lamplight danced on the walls, Sarah sat by her desk, writing by candle glow. The preacher is not what he appears. There is smoke, always smoke, curling from his words and deeds. I will not look away. Outside, in the hush that lay over Holly Glen, the river moved beneath its skim of ice, swift, relentless, bearing secrets downstream. Winter continued to press itself over Holly Glen. The rituals of daily life became a vital anchor, something to hold on to as suspicion crept into hearts. Each morning, the bark of dogs and the crow of roosters awakened the scattered houses. The town's rhythm navigated hardship and tradition. Water drawn from wells, bread baked from corn ground at the mill, boots trudged through frost-dusted fields. The only break in routine came with Vale's influence, a preacher who seemed to redefine what was normal, shifting boundaries with every sermon. In these months, Holly Glen's social web tightened. Neighbors leaned in closer, seeking reassurance in routine. Children continued lessons in the drafty one-room schoolhouse. Evenings were for repairing harnesses and carving names into wooden fence rails. The cold was persistent, but not as paralyzing as the uncertainty within. Men still debated politics and crop prices at the general store, often speaking quietly when Vale's name surfaced in conversation. Women shared food and sorrows at wash barrels and quilting bees, bonding over whispers and weary sighs. Law and order, in 1901 Tennessee, meant respect for the sheriff and a wary trust in town elders. The sheriff, Mr. Percy Hall, was a broad-shouldered man who believed in fairness, but he avoided direct confrontation with the preacher. The law was a patchwork affair, simple, local, sometimes bending to the influence of respected men. Most disputes were settled on porches or at town meetings, with palms upturned and voices low. Justice was personal, and the specter of violence hung always at the margin, kept at bay by shared values and an implacable belief in redemption. Yet redemption now seemed scarce. Vale preached longer, demanded confession not just from the pulpit, but in weekly rounds to homes. He insisted on private visits, urging families to unburden themselves, offering absolution for a price few could articulate. Over time, fear overtook trust. When a second child, a boy named Will Turner, pale-haired and quiet, fell ill and vanished from play, the town trembled. Vale was there at the mother's side, promising that the Lord's fire refines those most beloved. Sarah Caldwell, restless as ever, saw the effect. The preacher's persistence altered people's sense of community. Simple neighborly visits grew strained. Folks began to lock their doors at sunset. Evenings, a time once reserved for storytelling on porches, now ended early, families drawn inward by their own suspicions. But traditions survived, stubborn. On Sundays, families wore their best wool and gathered for church, women in simple bonnets, men in coats frayed at the cuffs, children solemn yet wide-eyed. The sanctuary was filled with the smells of stone, candle wax, and rosewater. Vale strode the aisle with purpose, words sharper each week. The doctrine of sacrifice, indeed suffering, became the cornerstone of his teaching. The ritual of passing the collection plate felt charged, nearly ominous. After service, the older men gathered at the steps to speak on the merits of hard work, the perseverance needed to triumph over the unkindness of weather or fate. Sarah joined them, standing beside Mrs. Gray, whose eyes never seemed to rest. They spoke in code about fear and faith, sometimes pausing as Vale swept by with a stiff nod. Other rituals took on new significance. Baptisms in the river became tests of strength rather than celebrations. with Vale's grip on the children's arms firm, even painful, some said. At funerals, bereaved families wore black for weeks, comforted only by each other. The preacher presided, but his prayers sometimes sounded like accusations, and the bereaved avoided his gaze. Vale's control grew. When an elderly parishioner died, his eulogy thundered with warnings. "The fire burns away flesh and sin alike," he pronounced, voice echoing through the rafters. Outside, the river carried ice and memory. Sarah suspected him now more than ever. Her journal grew thick with notes. Each odd phrase, each glance exchanged between Vale and the sheriff, each moment when Vale appeared as if summoned to disaster. She noticed most of all how Vale isolated those he most targeted, demanding loyalty while creating cycles of guilt and fear. Conversations once gentle now bristled with tension. Community rituals were becoming Vale's tool for control. A change arrived with the spring thaw. The snow melted, leaving muddy tracks everywhere. Families emerged from houses, hungry for sunlight, careful in their interactions. Sarah visited the Gray family, listening to Mrs. Gray recount, as she had so many times before, the last sighting of Lila. But this time, Sarah detected something new, a resignation, a folding into sorrow. As if hope had died alongside trust. Rumors circulated about Vale's childhood, stories from out-of-state visitors who claimed they recognized his style, his intensity. A woman passing through said, "Men like that burn, yes, they burn everything around them." Sarah pressed for details, but the woman shook her head and left, her warnings trailing in the dust. The sheriff called a town meeting to address the rising unease. The discussion was long, punctuated by outbursts and silences. Vale attended, sitting near the stove with his Bible in his lap. He offered cryptic comfort, deflected direct questions, and left early. Some proposed forming a watch, or even seeking help beyond Holly Glen, but tradition held sway. Outsiders were rarely trusted, and bringing them in would shatter fragile customs. Sarah saw last year's events repeating, a ritual of avoidance, a circle of faith and suspicion, tightening around those most vulnerable. The preacher's presence at fires, illnesses, and disappearances was becoming more than coincidence. One evening, as Sarah sat with the grieving Gray family, Mrs. Gray confessed, "Sometimes, when Vale prays, I hear something else, something hungry." Sarah left with resolve. Tradition in Holly Glen could shelter evil if unchecked. It was time to challenge the ritual, time to break the pattern. But she knew, with every word she wrote in her journal and every secret conversation in lamplit kitchens, that Vale's hold on the town was nearly complete. Outside, dusk melted into darkness, the pine trees whispering in cold spring wind. Holly Glen's rituals persisted, but now they were tinged with dread, each act shadowed by the possibility of another loss. Sarah turned up her collar, stepped onto the empty road, and walked toward the church. Somewhere in the dark, Thomas Vale waited. The community's trust, their rituals and routines, would soon face their greatest trial. By early April, the air in Holly Glen had shifted. Gone was the oppressive winter fog, replaced by the inconsistencies of spring, chilly mornings, an intoxicating scent of dew and mud that clung to boots with inescapable tenacity. The pines and oaks began to flush green again, and the river hurried along swollen with the memory of melted snow. Yet for all appearances of new beginnings, an invisible tension tangled itself through every corner of town, binding Holly nights in quiet panic. The absentee children, first Lila, then Will, were never far from anyone's thoughts. Their absence gnawed at the community's sense of safety, prying open old wounds and creating new ones. Gossip disguised as concern moved through Holly Glen with the persistence of spring wind. Some said Vale's demands for confession were born from genuine care. Others saw only a monstrous zeal, a hunger that no act of penitence could possibly sate. Sarah Caldwell, drawn further into her role as silent witness and relentless observer, felt the strain in fragile gestures, the fleeting smile of a neighbor at the well, the way men now greeted each other with curt nods instead of stories. Even the rituals of meals, once filled with laughter and debate, were shorter, quieter. A town used to resilience was growing brittle. Mrs. Gray's house became a gathering place for the quietly discontent. Behind drawn curtains, Sarah, Mrs. Gray, and a handful of others, an aging shopkeeper, a skeptical young farmer, a mother with sharp eyes, reviewed every clue, every oddity Vale brought into their lives. Sarah read her notes aloud. The strange phrases, atrocities disguised as doctrine, the sickening comfort the preacher took in standing at the scene of every local disaster. They debated whether the sheriff could be trusted, or if his loyalty, like so many others, was tangled in the preacher's web. Meanwhile, Vale tightened his hold. He increased his presence in parishioners' homes under the guise of prayer meetings, his questions always digging, eyes always searching for evidence of what he called hidden rot. Children grew wary, sometimes crying when asked to kneel. Parents, cowed by tradition and Vale's authority, seldom objected aloud. When spring rain battered the rooftops, flooding fields and briefly turning the main road into a shallow creek, Vale was the first to brave the water, Bible held above his head as he recited psalms with a mournful certainty. The townfolk watched him, split evenly between awe and suspicion. A quiet Sunday afternoon revealed the next fracture. Following the church service, Vale led a group of men to clear debris from a collapsed barn on the edge of town. Sarah followed at a distance, notebook in hand, pretending to help. She watched how Vale worked, brisk and efficient, yet his direction was always absolute. His tone brooked no disagreement. Midway through hauling the sodden wood, a neighbor, John Hadley, found a scorched and half-buried locket inscribed with the name Will. When he lifted it, everyone fell silent. Vale stepped forward and took the locket from John without ceremony, holding it up for all to see. His words were oddly flat, a sign, a calling to honesty and renewal. The fire consumes all things of this world until we surrender our burdens. John looked to Sarah, bewildered, but no one spoke further. Most went home soon after, dragging their muddy tools in the dusk. That night a heavy silence draped the town. Sarah's dreams were troubled by images of running water and smouldering ruins. In every fragment, Vale's eyes appeared, cold and expectant. That week, Vale called a public meeting for communal cleansing and honesty. Holly Glen gathered at the church, uncertain, bracing against an undefined threat. The pews were packed, bodies pressed close in the flickering candlelight. Vale spoke with intensity, his voice cracking as he urged the town to lay bare every unspoken sin, for nothing hidden would escape the blaze of God's truth. Panicked glances flickered among the congregation, but a few, shaken by weeks of fear, stood and confessed petty trespasses, a disputed fence line, a stolen egg, a spiteful word. Some almost sobbed with relief as Vale pronounced them absolved. Others, including Sarah, sensed the dangerous shift. The preacher fed on these confessions, eyes brightening at every new admission. Sarah left the meeting with her heart pounding. She found Mrs. Gray waiting for her in the shadows of the churchyard. Mrs. Gray whispered that Vale had visited her late one night, pressing for any secrets, any anger she might harbor toward her missing daughter. "When I refused, his look chilled my bones," she admitted. "He wants to own what we hide." Determined, Sarah started discreetly speaking with other women, those marked by grief or exhaustion, those Vale visited often. Stories emerged of strange, threatening prayers whispered in small rooms, of objects rearranged, small keepsakes gone missing, as if to remind his flock their suffering was always within his grasp. By mid-spring, the farms surrounding Holly Glen hummed with life. The town, meanwhile, pulsed with paranoia. Any sign, a chicken lost, an argument overheard, smoke seen at dusk, could ignite rumor or dread. Sarah realized Vale was shaping these patterns intentionally, a master at manipulating guilt and fear into submission. One afternoon, Mrs. Gray called Sarah to her home, holding out a ribbon burned at one end, a twin. They agreed to Lila's favorite. Sarah recognized it as the one she had seen left on the altar, that cold winter morning. "He is telling us in every way he can that he alone holds the key to truth or mercy," Mrs. Gray whispered. Sarah copied the detail into her journal. The thread of evidence lengthening, tightening. Sarah resolved, quietly but absolutely, she would find concrete proof of Vale's crimes, even if it meant risking everything, her standing, her safety, her world. She closed her notebook, drew the oil lamp closer, and stared out her window at the preacher's silhouette, crossing the muddy road, never pausing, always watching. Outside, the shadows from the swaying trees stretched long in the wild light, and Holly Glen, still dignified, still proud, waited for the next tremor, the next spark. None would guess, not yet, how close their world was to being set ablaze. Spring blossomed reluctantly across the Tennessee hills. The clay roads that circled and cut through Holly Glen settled after the floods, leaving deep ruts and a memory of the winter's harshness etched into the land. Farms encircling the little town came back to life as families tilled earth long held by generations, planting corn, sorghum, and orchard rows, driving mules through fields with a steady rhythm. In between the churning of soil and the cycles of planting, life attempted normalcy, but the shadow of Thomas Vale grew longer with each sunrise. The rituals of the farming community kept people busy. Early morning milking, children hauling water from the well, women baking bread and tending house gardens, but these familiar acts were undercut by a pervasive sense of watchfulness. Those who once visited each other's porches at dusk now eyed the lanes, measuring every unfamiliar step, every out-of-place voice. The news of 2 missing children, the fires, and the strange way the preacher moved through their lives left a stain that could not be scrubbed by hard work or Sunday hymns. Community in Holly Glen was both shield and prison. For some, the bonds of kinship were protection. For others, they became barriers as confession and suspicion twisted once friendly ties. Trust, the currency of a small town, grew scarce. A neighbor's greeting became an inquiry, a child's question met with quiet shushing and quick glances. Even laughter at the general store felt at moments too loud, too risky. Sarah Caldwell felt it harder than most. Her growing alliance with the cautious and grieving, Mrs. Gray chief among them, made her presence more conspicuous. Rumors spread that Sarah was stirring the pot, a woman too curious for her own safety. Yet she pressed on, watching Vale's sermons turn ever more apocalyptic, each parable darker, each prescription sterner. One afternoon, she walked the bounds of the Turner farm with Owen Turner, Will's father. The fields were patchy with new shoots of green. "Folks say you're after Vale," he said quietly, the words almost lost to the wind. "Some think you'll only bring more trouble." Sarah hesitated, looking over the low fence at the muddy furrows. "How much more can we take before someone does something worse?" Owen nodded, tired. "Some of us are with you, Sarah, but we need proof. Without it, he's just a preacher and we're just angry." Proof was difficult to come by. The investigation methods in rural towns at the turn of the century were crude. The sheriff relied on eyewitness rumor and strong-armed questioning. The town elders preferred mediation and silence, believing public shame to be the greatest deterrent. Proper detectives were summoned only for the very worst, usually months after events made headlines, long after the trail had gone cold. Crime scene protocols were non-existent. A fire drew a crowd, trampling possible clues under gathering feet. Evidence, such as it was, disappeared as quickly as it surfaced. Sarah's journal grew thick with names and strange incidents. She documented everything: Vale's whereabouts when the barn burned, each private confession he heard, the items of Lila's and Will's found in odd places. The town, she realized, was caught in a loop. Something bad happened. Vale declared it God's judgment, the town confessed, and the circle of fear tightened a little more. But the human cost was piling up in more ways than disappearance and fear. Mental anguish was surfacing among both young and old. Nightmares, growing tempers, a sense of faintness that did not abate with rest. As in other rural towns of the era, suffering souls had no recourse but each other. There were no doctors trained in nerves or melancholy. Only the encouragement to pray harder or keep busy until the cloud passed. Some, privately, admitted to Sarah they felt themselves slipping away, afraid of both Vale and the evil he insisted lurked in every heart. With the start of real spring, the preacher's plans escalated. Vale announced a massive cleansing revival, a week of nightly services, with strict attendance expected from every family. The church, already the pulse of town life, became a command post, its doors open late, lamplight glowing through the stained glass until midnight. Sarah described the first of these nights in her journal. "The pews are full." His voice is thunder itself. I watched the children shrink from his gaze. The air is hot, too hot for April. 3 women confessed to made-up sins. Vale wept for them with gratitude. I felt the crowd swelling, needing permission for something I do not yet understand. He is not just leading, he is building something. On the second night, a fight broke out behind the church, 2 young men accusing each other of theft. Vale separated them with careful showmanship, pronouncing both delivered to the flame for truth. The sheriff, wary and helpless, looked from Sarah to Mrs. Gray and shook his head. "There's no law for this kind of trouble," he muttered. Each night the pressure rose. Vale's sermons became more accusatory. "We are a garden overrun with weeds," he thundered. "And sometimes God must burn the field to save it." Those few who did not attend found their absence noted publicly on Sunday. Vale's disappointment, a weapon as sharp as a lash. Sarah and Mrs. Gray spent their days interviewing townsfolk, now frightened of their own shadows. They heard confessions of pain, regret, and desperate bargains. Some women, once robust and independent, now seemed haunted, eyes darting at small noises. The ache of unspoken trauma, of secrets grown too loud to contain, filled many houses. "It's like he knows what hurts us most and digs there," Mrs. Gray whispered. As the revival drew toward its end, Vale orchestrated a penultimate act. One evening, he called the children forward, laying hands on every head, staring into every pair of frightened eyes until many began crying. "The lambs must be pure or the flock will be lost," he said, his grip tightening as frightened parents watched, powerless, cowed by tradition and their own belief in redemption through trials. Sarah left the church trembling, her resolve hardening. She returned to her small house, spread her journal across the kitchen table, and began writing letters, one to a cousin in Knoxville, another to an old friend living in Nashville, beseeching them to help her bring outside lawmen or reporters to Holly Glen. It was a risk, one that might brand her an outcast. But she could no longer abide the grip of fear Vale had constructed, brick by brick, word by word. That same night, Mrs. Gray appeared at her doorstep, breathless. In her hand was a piece of charred cloth. "I found it in the woods near Vale's path from the river," she whispered. Sarah compared the cloth to a dress Lila once wore, a match unmistakable. It was at last something tangible, something she could show the sheriff and, if necessary, the world outside Holly Glen. But even as hope flickered, their danger grew. A neighbor reported seeing Vale late at night outside Sarah's window, simply watching, silent, unmoving. The preacher's sermons shifted tone. He spoke of false witnesses, the punishers of the righteous, and cursed Jezebels, seeking to bring sin back into the fold. Sarah felt the town's mood turn, like a field about to catch fire. All it needed was a match. Still, she pressed on. Letters sent, evidence hidden under a loose floorboard. Sarah made plans with Mrs. Gray. The time to reveal Vale was coming. Their courage wasn't certainty, but necessity, born from the knowledge that to do nothing was to let the darkness win. In the final days of the revival, Vale sensed his flock's uncertainty. He doubled down, calling for one last act of total confession. Those who claimed to have nothing to confess, he insisted, were hiding the greatest sins of all. That night the church was packed, the air so stifling it felt unable to hold another secret. Sarah stood, her journal clutched to her chest, and for the first time in months felt something close to real hope. Even monsters, she reminded herself, could be unmasked. If only someone dared to shine the light. Outside, thunder rolled far away across the Tennessee hills, as if something vast was waking. The days following the final revival in Holly Glen moved with unnatural slowness. Skies were sullen and overcast, the Tennessee air holding a wetness that seemed to seep straight into the bones. The normal pulse of spring, the clatter of wagons, laughter from porches, children's shouts carried on the breeze, was muted by the raw exhaustion of a community spent from nights of fear. Confession and accusation. Sarah Caldwell felt the pressure mounting like a storm behind her eyes. She woke each morning peering through her window for any sign of Vale or his followers. Even routine tasks had acquired a new wariness. She sipped her coffee, poised for interruption, and every knock at the door made her heart pound with the urgency of both hope and terror. Word spread that an outsider, a Methodist circuit rider passing through on his way east, had noticed the unrest in town and written a letter to authorities in Nashville. Some townsfolk eyed each other with relief, others with suspicion. Vale, however, did not let up. The preacher's sermons grew desperate, his voice louder, the metaphors more feverish. He warned that evil always calls down judgment upon itself, and promised a day of reckoning for anyone who conspired with devils or threatened the unity of Holly Glen. Sarah met with Mrs. Gray. and Owen Turner in the shadows of the Gray's barn. The charred cloth, the locket, Sarah's copious notes, these were now more than rumors. Still, Owen shook his head. Fear's stronger than proof in a place like this. We need more. We need someone from outside who'll believe us. Sarah nodded, painfully aware that faith in outsiders came rarely in rural 1901, but she had no other cards left. On the third night after the revival's end, a fire broke out near the riverbank, painting the black sky orange and sending the townsfolk running with buckets and blankets. It was a smaller blaze, the tool shed belonging to the miller, but the symbolism cut deep. The fire's origin was suspicious, and the town's only mill would be crippled for weeks. Vale arrived as the flames faded, hands raised, the light making his shadow loom as he repeated, "This is what happens when we turn from faith. Everything unpure will be cleansed." Sarah watched people lower their heads in shame, exhausted and resigned. For every doubter, there were three whose will had been broken by Vale's constant pressure, whose minds yearned for an easy explanation for all their suffering. No matter how logical her evidence, Sarah realized the town now bent under the weight of months of cultivated fear. The sheriff himself stopped Sarah in the road that week. His voice was low, tired. "Some say this is just misfortune, Sarah. Others think you're making things worse. If what you say is true, you need to go to Nashville yourself. Bring back someone with authority. I fear for you if you stay." That same evening, Mrs. Gray found Sarah at the well. "He's watching me. Sometimes I wake and Vale is in front of my window. Not moving, not knocking. Just standing. I can't sleep. Sometimes I think he's waiting for me to do something, anything." Sarah squeezed her hand. "You're not alone. And you're not losing your mind." Daily life in the farming community grew harsher. Young men started sleeping with shotguns propped by their doors. Women walked the lanes in pairs. The field still demanded work, but hands slowed and children played closer to home, never beyond shouting distance. The town's isolation felt absolute, its everyday hardships now doubled, as if Vale's shadow stretched to every corner. Anxiety, a dull hum all winter, turned sharp and frantic. A week after the fire, Sarah got her first reply from outside, the Nashville cousin's letter, delivered by a mail rider on a rain-soaked afternoon. "I showed your notes to a newspaper man here," it read. "He wants to come. He's bringing a constable. Be careful. Don't trust anyone until they arrive." Mrs. Gray wept at the news. "It might be our chance. Lila and Will, they can't just vanish." That night, in anticipation and dread, Sarah prepared her house, hiding evidence, planning escape routes, praying Vale would not sense how near the edge everything was. The day the constable and the newspaper man arrived, the townsfolk lined the edge of the main road, their faces a mix of curiosity and terror. Vale met them with open arms, inviting them to join that evening's service, his voice warm and friendly. The constable, a stern man in a city suit, declined politely, but walked the town square and mill neighborhood, eyes sharp for signs of trouble. The newspaper man took notes as Sarah, with trembling hands, gave him her account. He examined the locket, the cloth, her diary, and promised to stay long enough to see for himself. The sheriff came unsure but agreed to help, though Sarah could read the fear in his eyes. "If this goes wrong, Sarah, this town will never recover," he whispered when the others moved away. That night's church service was tense. Vale preached as if nothing had happened, voice smooth, each line more righteous than the last. During the closing hymn, the constable rose and addressed the congregation, asking about the fires, the lost children, the secrets passed down dusty lanes. There was only silence, save for the creak of pews and breathing tight with nerves. When the constable left, a group of townsfolk followed, some angry, some relieved. That night Sarah barely slept. Even the river seemed to quiet under the oppressive hush. By dawn, Mrs. Gray burst into Sarah's home. She'd seen Vale behind the church with a bundle, cloth and rope dirt-stained. The constable and newspaper man rushed to investigate. There, near the roots of an ancient oak, they discovered a shallow grave, hastily concealed, the disturbed earth so fresh the morning dew had not yet dried. The townsfolk gathered, silent and pale, while the authorities unearthed the remains, the child's sash, a rusted brooch. There was no mistaking what they had found. For a moment the spell was broken. Neighbors cried out in horror, people clung to each other in anguish and rage. Vale, still in his preacher's robes, tried to speak, but this time the words sputtered. The constable ordered him restrained. Vale's protestations, so convincing in the pulpit, now sounded twisted and hollow in the morning air. Sarah clung to Mrs. Gray, feeling every bruise and ache of the last year rise up in her chest. "It's over," Mrs. Gray whispered, though Sarah knew for a time at least nothing would ever be over for Holly Glen. News of the grave's discovery swept through Holly Glen long before dawn's first blush crept above the hills. The normally quiet Tennessee town awoke to anxious murmurs, clusters of neighbors forming at fence lines and along muddy footpaths, their faces taut with a mingled dread and disbelief. In the pale morning light, the constable had posted his deputy at both ends of the main road, and for the first time in decades, the church doors remained locked. Their heavy iron key surrendered to someone other than its preacher. Thomas Vale was confined to the back room of the parsonage, a man alternately raging and withdrawn. The authority, the awe that once clung to his every word had dissolved. Now even his most fervent supporters kept their distance, unwilling to meet his eyes, fearful to be seen in his company. The constable, dispatched from Nashville on Sarah's plea, refused to let him alone for a moment. Not that Vale would have escaped. The preacher sat slumped, no longer defending himself with words, but instead scribbling scripture onto the walls in shaking hands, like a man desperate to claim at least his own absolution. On the streets, townsfolk moved slowly, every outing charged with the sense that the whole world was watching, as if God's gaze had alighted upon their valley and refused to let go. For the first time in memory, mothers forbade their children from running wild in the fields or visiting neighbors without escort. Curtains stayed shut far past sunrise. Barn doors were not just locked, but barred with 2x4s. Fathers gathered at crossroads and carriage sheds, but no longer to swap stories or rib each other with gentle jokes. Their talk was guarded, glances uneasy, hands often clenched in silent prayers. Sarah Caldwell found herself unexpectedly at the heart of it all. In the days following the unearthing of Lila and Will's resting place, grief colored every interaction. Those who had once scoffed at Sarah's suspicions now approached carefully, apologies barely whispered. Families came to her small home with trembling voices and confessions of guilt for not seeing Vale's darkness sooner, for doubting their own instincts, for relying too heavily on faith at the expense of vigilance. Sarah listened as best as she could, writing responses she could not always say aloud, her own sorrow and anger pent up until it ached. She often walked to Mrs. Gray's house at dusk, not for answers, but simply to remind them both that they had survived. The constable's investigation continued through the week, joined by the newspaperman, who took careful notes for a story that would stretch far beyond Tennessee's borders. The two of them combed the parsonage and church, finding among Vale's few possessions a half-burned journal, faded scraps of ribbon, small trinkets from the missing children. On reading Vale's cruelly detailed entries, the cold scripts of justification muddled with scripture, there was no longer any doubt for even the most reluctant. The preacher had not only led Holly Glen astray, but watched it burn from within. Town meetings were held at the schoolhouse, as the church itself felt tainted, too full of old echoes. The sheriff, hollow-eyed and gaunt, stood beside the constable, fielding questions from neighbors who now demanded answers and justice in ways entirely new for their small community. "We let the rot go too deep," one man muttered, head bowed. "It'll be generations before anyone truly trusts again." Sarah often spoke at these meetings, sometimes by request, sometimes because silence threatened to choke her. She told the truth, neither shifting blame nor excusing herself. Her journal became evidence, read aloud alongside Mrs. Gray's recollections and the children's recovered belongings. With each meeting, the town peeled back another layer of collective hurt, every revelation blurring the line between victim and bystander. Those days were punctuated by long stretches of silence, the kind that filled bedrooms at midnight and kitchens at dawn. The bakery remained closed, its sign swinging in the wind. The general storekeeper opened only for an hour each day, accepting payment with trembling hands. The river, once a place for sport and washing, now bore witness as townsfolk paused at its banks to pray for souls lost, and perhaps their own. Some in town tried to erase Vale's memory quickly. His name was scratched from the ledger in the church office, his sermons tossed into the fire, his personal effects boxed up with trembling hands. Others resisted this amnesia, insisting their children remember the hard lesson, that evil's true face was not horns and shadow, but a man who shook their hands every Sunday. Old resentments surfaced as grief turned to anger, at themselves, at their neighbors, at Vale for seducing them with his certainty. When the carriage from Nashville finally arrived in town, the entire population gathered in silence along the main road. Under the overhanging branches of oaks just beginning to bud, Vale was led out, hands bound, expression inscrutably serene. He glanced neither left nor right, ignoring the gasps and shouts, the stones that never left shaken fists. Sarah stood toward the front, Mrs. Gray at her side. Neither spoke, but both felt the moment as an ending and a warning. Vale's departure did not bring the peace many had imagined. In the days that followed, there were more funerals, not from violence but weariness and heartbreak. Yet beneath the grief, small signs of recovery emerged. Children's laughter returning to the yards, neighbors lingering a moment longer at the pump, a loaf of bread left on Sarah's porch with a note, "Thank you. You saved us when we couldn't save ourselves." In the dusk, Holly Glen braced itself for the first church service without Vale. The sheriff, not a preacher by calling, read aloud from the Psalms, voice trembling but resolute. He spoke of endurance, of the long pain that must be endured, and finished with a plea for forgiveness, not just for the living, but for the town itself. Sarah watched the light fade through the stained glass, uncertain what the future held. But for the first time in many long months, she felt the weight ease. Holly Glen would heal, slowly, imperfectly, in fits and starts. What had happened would never be forgotten, and the story of Thomas Vale would remain, a caution and a scar, under the eyes of all who had survived. Weeks passed slowly in the shadow left by Thomas Vale. Holly Glen inched toward spring, as if waking from a nightmare, each day marked by small, halting efforts to reclaim life and rebuild trust. The scars of grief and betrayal ran deep, stitched into every conversation, every glance exchanged on the muddy lanes that wound through town. Families took their meals by the flicker of lamplight, no longer speaking of faith as a shield, but as a question they now asked together. The church, once a vessel filled with Vale's insistent, fevered sermons, reopened its doors, sparse, silent at first. The sheriff read the lessons, honest and raw, never daring to preach. Each Sunday the benches filled a little more, as neighbors began relearning the comfort of shared presence. Yet even amidst the growing sound of hymns, it was clear that church was changed, no longer the unquestioned heart of the community, but a place to gather, reflect, and remember. Sarah Caldwell became a figure of strength in the eyes of many. Though some still harbored resentment or whispered that outsiders had meddled too much, the majority approached her with grateful words and weary hands extending gifts of bread, canned vegetables, or pie. She continued her habit of writing each night, shaping the story not only for herself, but for those who couldn't yet bear to speak it aloud. Mrs. Gray retreated to her porch, often lost in thought as she gazed at the fields where Lila once played. In small ways she allowed herself hope. A new quilt sewn by the fireplace, a song returned to the evening breeze. She began to host neighbors again, letting gentle conversation take root, slowly healing in the company of others. Her resilience inspired Sarah, reminding her that even the deepest sorrow could, in time, fuel something like peace. Children returned to the schoolhouse after a long pause, laughter tentatively pealing across the dusty yard. Lessons resumed, but the air was quieter, questions arranged by the rhythm of caution rather than mere curiosity. The schoolmistress spoke to them of safety, kindness, and the lesson that evil need not wear a monstrous face to do harm. The river swelled with spring rains, carrying lost things away, pieces of ruined barns, burnt ribbons found at the bank, the final winter's ice. The water, always moving, signaled both ending and renewal. Sarah often walked beside it in the evenings, her journal tucked tight beneath her arm, reflecting on how far she and the town had come. In time, word of Vale's crimes made its way to Nashville, and farther still. The story became caution and warning in sermons across Tennessee and as distant as New York. Holly Glen was forever marked, but as the initial shock faded, the community grew determined not to let tragedy define them. The church organized charity for grieving families. The storekeeper extended lines of credit to those most hurt, and neighbors banded together to rebuild what had been lost. barns, trust, and ultimately, the sense that goodness could still grow from burned earth. Sarah watched these changes, recording the turning of days in measured words. She saw in Mrs. Gray the courage to begin again, in the sheriff the humility of facing his limits, and in herself the stubborn hope that small acts of defiance mattered most. Holly Glen, she wrote, was learning that faith without suspicion is dangerous, but that forgiveness could coexist with vigilance, that only through honest reckoning and collective care could they forge genuine resilience. On the first warm Sunday of summer, the community gathered for a picnic beneath the old oaks on the riverbank. There were tears, certainly, as stories surfaced again, but laughter and music wove through the afternoon. Sarah stood beside Mrs. Gray as neighbors carried food, told jokes, played games. The wounds of Holly Glen were not fully healed, nor would they ever be. But the willingness to move forward, and to do so together, was a testament to what survived. At dusk, with fireflies flickering in the grass and the river running clear, Sarah closed her journal and listened. The voices of Holly Glen, damaged but unbroken, echoed in the soft air. The preacher was gone, but life, steady and ordinary, was returning. From the ashes of one man's cruelty, new roots grew, cautious, hopeful, enduring. The story of Thomas Vale, the preacher who burned for God, would live on in warning. But Holly Glen would endure in its own quiet way, choosing every day to trust again, to forgive, to turn sorrow into strength. Sarah, gazing into the gathering night, knew the world could be cruel, but here in this patch of Tennessee life would go on. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.